Okay, welcome to History 112, modern history of modern America. Um, since this is the first one, I'll real quickly just tell you. I hope that you can get acquainted with the syllabus and the schedule. Each week we'll have a PowerPoint presentation like this, and then YouTube or History Channel or other links that help you guys kind of get a grasp of what kind of information you need to do the weekly assignments. Other than that, just get acquainted with how the class works. You guys will get the hang of it real quick. Everything is due at the same time every week, so there shouldn't be any confusion with that. Um, if there are questions about the book reviews or assignments or anything, please feel free to email me at any time or come see me in my office. I'm usually there. I recognize quite a few names from classes I've had before, so you know that you can come talk to me whenever you'd like, either office hours or by appointment. I'm usually fairly free. So anyways, let's get started, and we're going to start talking about what historians call the kind of the 10-15 years right after the Civil War, and what they call it is the Reconstruction period, because it's a time when people from the North were trying to reconstruct the South, and the very, very large question, obviously, is what do we do with the 3 to 4 million freed slaves now that they have their freedom? And so we're going to kind of go through and see what happens. So throughout the semester, we're going to be talking about how Americans view freedom and how it's changed dramatically since the end of the Civil War. In fact, it's changed dramatically in your lifetime, how Americans view freedom. But before we discuss that and how different parts of the country viewed freedom right after the war, we'll just go through a few things that happened right after the war that kind of helped shape the Reconstruction process and in essence help shape American life today. We're still dealing with what happened during Reconstruction. A very good example of that is what's happening in Ferguson, Missouri right now. It's very apparent that American society still has a problem dealing with racial issues, no matter who does what to who. And a lot of this, people argue, is because of how the Civil War ended and what happened afterwards. So, right after Sherman burns Atlanta and the South gives up, he issues Special Order 15, which gave each freed slave 40 acres and a mule. At this time, African Americans thought that Lincoln went to war for them, and really, many people argued the war didn't start because of slavery, but it ended up being completely about slavery, especially after the Emancipation Proclamation. And so, with this Special Order 15, freed slaves, African Americans, start to really define freedom as working for yourself, earning from the fruits of your labors, and so then you can start saving money, you can enlist it, you can start being part of the government. A lot of freed slaves argued we are intelligent enough to do all of these things. We sacrificed for the government. We helped win the war. And what we want is we want our own land, and we want to be able to do what white people are able to do. That is kind of the sense of what a lot of freed slaves believed freedom meant. Owning land and being able to do what white people do. Okay, and the Special Order 15, many believed, was a good step in that direction. The problem is once Abraham Lincoln got shot, his successor, Andrew Johnson, who was from the South, he was not necessarily pro-slavery. In fact, he was anti-slavery, but he was from the South, and he kind of rescinds Special Order 15. So he comes in and says Sherman's order is not going to happen, and he sends men down there to make sure that it doesn't, and he gives a lot of the land back to the white people whose land was taken from them. A lot of large landowners. This was met with disbelief, and many were trying to understand why this occurred. Most people argue it's just because Johnson was from the South. He was anti-slavery, but at the same time, he didn't want to necessarily punish the South for the war. And we'll talk about radical Reconstructionists, and that's kind of their whole idea is the South started the war, they lost the war, they should be punished for it. Whereas Lincoln especially, and Johnson were kind of against that. So without a lot of Northern pressure, the Southern government in 1865 passed the Black Codes, which is what they were called. These regulated the lives of former slaves, and the government was still white men who were voted in by white men only. Women didn't have a vote either. Okay, so the Black Codes did allow them to marry each other, but you could not date or marry a white person if you were an African American. Did give them a little bit of land, gave them limited access to courts, but freed slaves couldn't serve on juries, vote, or be in state militias. They had vagrant laws, meaning you couldn't congregate, or if you don't pay taxes, could be considered a vagrant. And the problem is not a lot of freed slaves could pay taxes because they didn't have any money, and nobody helped them get a job, right? Basically, what ends up happening is the North wins the war, long story short, and then they say 4 million people, you're free. Now go make the best of it. And as we'll see through class, this kind of creates animosity in the South and in the North later. The Black Codes also were about civil rights in the sense that you could not marry a white person if you were African American. You could sue, but you could only sue other freed slaves. They could not carry firearms, or the fine was $10, which back then was no freed slave had $10 to their name, let alone being able to own a firearm. And even worse, if a white person would give a freed slave or sell a freed slave a firearm, they could be fined up to $50 and put in jail for a month. Okay, so what ends up happening is the South loses the war, but the North didn't understand and didn't really want to reconstruct the South. And it was hard because a lot of Southern people fought it. And so what ends up happening is these Black Codes and run completely by a white man government, literally men, were passing all of these laws saying, well, I guess we're part of the Union now, but we're still going to try to live our lives the way we used to. And they do a fairly good job of keeping control over over everything. At the same time, a thing starts happening called sharecropping, and this is a very difficult situation for a lot of the free slaves and a lot of the poorer white people. You have to understand, not that many people in the South actually owned slaves, and if you did, it's roughly 1 to 3 slaves. You know, this idea of huge plantations everywhere and Gone with the Wind type of places, those were very few and far between. Very few people owned slaves in the South. Most of the South were poor white people who worked just as hard as the slaves did, only they were working for themselves, not for somebody else. So what happens is they start to sharecrop, which means these freed slaves, since they didn't own land, would work on the land for the owners for a share of the crops. The hope was this would later morph or evolve into renting or leasing the land, with the eventual idea that maybe you could buy some of it if you could afford it. But the main problem with this was after the Civil War, the price of cotton plummeted, and most people, freed slaves or poor whites, because a lot of the sharecroppers were poor white people as well, just could not make ends meet. And so we'll discuss this later. So there's kind of this movement. People start emigrating to the northern areas because there's just not enough land and there's just not enough money in cotton. A good example is let's say there's 10 acres of land. For half of that 10 acres, the person who is sharecropping would plant, cultivate, and raise everything for the landowner. But they would pay their own medical bills, they'd buy their own clothes, their own provisions, etc. So basically, they bound themselves to a 10-hour work day, and since they were freed slaves, they were free, but they didn't necessarily own the land. In fact, most of them did not. And so landowners still didn't do much work. Okay? So that's the idea of sharecropping. And it, as you as I just pointed out, this type of arrangement didn't work, especially since cotton prices fell. So this makes a lot of people emigrate to the north. And it creates a lot of animosity with freed slaves and poor whites to landowners, right? A lot of them felt like, well, what's the difference between this and slavery? You know? And there isn't a huge difference, just a little bit. This is not the idea of freedom that they thought they were going to have. Now, in the same sense, women's idea of freedom was to get the vote. They really wanted the vote, and they wanted an overhaul of divorce laws. You know, because even in the 1860s, for a woman to get divorced from her husband, she would have to prove adultery, desertion, or extreme abuse. Right? Even then, it was hard for a woman to get a divorce from a man. It was a lot easier for a male to divorce a woman, but if a woman started the proceedings, she had to prove one, if not all, of these things. And with this idea kind of comes the idea of just and authority of men over their lives, right? Women, it's not necessarily the idea that women don't want to get married. It's that they want to. This is when the idea of an equal partnership kind of starts germinating. And one of the main people with this was Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Maybe some of you have heard of her, but she was big in this kind of whole idea of women's suffrage and making marriage more of an equal partnership. She writes that men are scared to be equal because that gives them less power, and it's time for women to transfer from being a slave to being a free person. So she evokes kind of this language of women are slaves too, and she kind of hints that if African Americans can be free, then women should be able to free as well. She talks about being chained in a marriage. She uses this exact language to kind of prove that, look, women are slaves as well. She said that marriage contracts could be attained for people as young as 12 to 14, and that's slavery. A woman of 14 should not be married because she doesn't know any better. She says that's an arranged marriage, and that's not love, that's slavery. And she says, when women can marry for love, that is when we will be free. Okay, so she's evoking this language of slavery and marriage for a lot of women are the same thing. And this is really the beginning of the women equality movement. For Asian Americans, freedom was a little different. For them, it was to be allowed to move from country to country. There was a lot of animosity towards Asian Americans in the 1860s, especially because they were coming in from the West, and they were taking railroad jobs, and they were doing a lot of hard physical labor, and they were taking jobs that poor white people and freed slaves would be doing. A good example of this would be, if you guys are interested in this time of the movement west, watch the show Hell on Wheels. It's a very good sociological look at how freed slaves and old white slave owners and Northerners and Asian Americans kind of come together to build the railroad. It's a pretty good example of what the movement west meant. At the same time, a lot of Asian Americans were asking for absolute equality. You know, a couple of them argued we're a nation of black and white and everything in between, every color in between. This is America. It's based on immigrants. Everybody should be equal. Labor's abundant. Asian Americans come to work, we're employed, we will find out that if the land is good enough to live in, then it's good enough to die in, and we will work hard to make sure that this country prospers. Okay, so it's a little different from the African Americans in the sense that the Asian Americans had more freedom of movement in a sense because they were never slaves. But they were still asking for the same thing. They're asking for land. They say we're going to work hard and we're going to make this country better. We just need a chance to be equal. So that's kind of how Asian Americans viewed it. Um, at the same time, for a white American in the South and the North, there's a different idea of what freedom is. For but at the same time, for whites, freedom was a given. It was a birthright to be defended. Okay, so whether you were from the North or the South, if you were white and you were born in America, that means you were free. Okay, period. That means you can own land. That means you can work for wages. You are not a slave. You do not work for anybody else for free. If you are white, you are able to enjoy all of the privileges that America can offer you. At the same time, after the war, Southerners were not only morally defeated, and their whole idea of freedom had changed, but many had invested their whole life savings in the Southern war effort, and some actually had to work for the first time in their lives. So what really comes out of this is a real resentment towards African Americans and a real resentment towards the North. And it was hard, if not hard, to impossible for them to believe that the person who had worked for them for free for their whole lives and their dad's whole lives and their granddad's whole lives and for 200 years, that now they're an equal to them. Even if they're in the same socioeconomic group now, it was impossible. It was imprinted on them to understand that that these 4 million people who used to be slaves were now free and should be able to do exactly what they were doing. And I don't know, a lot of historians and sociologists argue that the South still hasn't recovered from that. At the same time, after the war, since the North won, Northerners not only did they define just being an American as being free, but since the North was more economically diverse and had larger infrastructure and industry, and it was still booming after the war. Many in the North defined freedom as free labor, and the idea that you can go and work hard and make money and earn money, and then it's your money and you can do whatever you want with it. So the South is kind of defining freedom as not being a slave or not being a freed slave, and the North is starting to get this whole idea of freedom as being economically sufficient, okay? Which, in a sense, is a lot of how Americans view freedom today. But at the same time, it's a bit different. Lastly, we'll just talk about the Freedmen's Bureau real quick. This was O.O. Howard was designated the head man of the Freedmen's Bureau, and what this was the the Northern government's Reconstruction ideals, and basically it's a bureau that was created by the government to go down to the South with some very daunting tasks. They were supposed to establish new schools for freed slaves, provide aid to the poor and the old, settle disputes between races, which was very hard to do, and try to get freed slaves freedom in the courts. Okay. The problem is that they sent fewer than 1,000 people down there. So over the next 10 years, this Freedmen Bureau really battled, and they actually did quite a bit of good. By 1869, they had 3,000 schools built, which means 150,000 freed slaves and poor white people who had never, whose parents and grandparents and parents before them never had even the thought of going to school, were actually in school at least till the 8th grade. They ran hospitals. They provided health care and drugs to both black and to both freed slaves and poor whites. Um, they did the best that they could. They kind of had this. They tried to reform land. It was a bit of a failure because they tried to get back to the Special Order 15 and give at least everybody some type of land, maybe not 40 acres and a mule, but they were really trying to cut up these estates and get as much government land as possible so they could portion it out to people and help them start their lives, right? Help them get farm implements, help them get seeds for harvesting, things of that nature. But what ends up happening is, with a lot of Southern resistance, Andrew Johnson kind of reneges on a lot of it, and O.O. Howard kind of gets hamstrung with not very big budget, and there were a lot of Southern people who fought this tooth and nail. This is kind of when the KKK starts. And so the KKK was not just about African Americans. They also disliked Catholics. They also disliked white people from the North who were coming down and who were trying to help build schools, or what we look here, these people in this picture, they're called carpetbaggers because they had carpet suitcases that they brought down. These people would come and they'd speculate and they'd buy up land because they're from the North and they have money, and then they would become landowners, and they were taking away much of what the South stood for 200 years. So there's this Freedmen's Bureau, these carpetbaggers, people coming into their land telling them what to do, and this created a lot of resentment in the South. So what ends up happening is, under Andrew Johnson, even though he kind of reins in the Freedmen's Bureau, under him, radical Reconstruction also starts. And we'll talk about that on our next slide. Okay, so we'll talk just a little bit about Andrew Johnson, just kind of to see how, maybe why he did some of the things that he did, and then we'll discuss who radical Republicans were and what they really wanted to do about Reconstruction and why, in essence, it failed. The picture in the middle is a man named Frederick Douglass. He's a very influential and great, if you ever get the chance to read any of his stuff, a very good writer. He was a freed slave. He talked with Abraham Lincoln quite a bit about what freedom was and things like that. So if you ever get the chance, read him. Very good writer. The thing about Andrew Johnson, like we discussed, was he was a Southerner, but he was a Union guy. He believed that it was illegal that the South seceded from the Union. So he was a Union guy, but he was, in essence, not capable of the task that was given to him. And not many men were. One of the only men probably who was capable was Abraham Lincoln, and to the South's detriment into today, they assassinated him. That was about the worst thing that could have happened to the South, because Abraham Lincoln was ready to forgive them, send them aid, and just rebuild the South and include it in part of the federal government. But what ends up happening is the divide remains because he was assassinated. Andrew Johnson, he was a racist. And in the end, what he does is he offers pardons to the white people who pledge allegiance to the Union. So anybody who fought for the South but then offers to be part of the Union again was pardoned. He was a poor person who hated aristocracy, but he really held in contempt those large landowners from the South. But in the end, he pardoned them as well. So what he does is, along with the Freedmen's Bureau, he sends people down there and he sets up provisional governorships to run elections to vote in new and loyal leaders, as in people who were, you could only run in the South if you repudiated secession, agreed that abolishing slavery was good, and that the Confederacy should pay the war debt that they created by going to war. And if you did that, then you were left alone. So there was no real, Andrew Johnson had no real set plan for what to do, except let's try to go down there and set up some semblance of a government, which you can't really blame the guy. It was the most deadly war in United States history, and as a lot of military historians point out, civil wars are by far the most brutal and violent and full of so much hatred, family on family, cousin on cousin, brother on brother. When they fight each other, things happen, bad things happen, and so it was hard. There was a lot of resentment in the South, and there was a lot of resentment in the North. The North blamed the South blamed the North, and so forth. So even though Andrew Johnson was basically a complete failure, you do have to give him a little bit of leeway, because there weren't many human beings on the planet who could have healed the wounds that the Civil War created. So when the Black Codes were passed in 1865, this split of the North and the South, and this idea that they're not really going to just get together and everybody's going to start singing along with each other, comes with the Black Codes. So what comes out of the Black Codes is this northern movement called the Radical Republicans, and they were led by a guy named Thaddeus Stevens. He was a senator, I believe, and he basically tells Andrew Johnson, to go stick it. He says, you're not doing anything. He says that those governments you set up down there, basically white people you appointed, who all they have to do is say a few words and then they get to keep their power. He says that's ridiculous. He says African freed slaves need equal rights. He wants to confiscate the land from landowners and divide it among former slaves. Okay, but you have to understand, this was radical. This was even too radical for most Northerners. Most Northerners, whether people understand this or if they don't want to, most Northerners weren't necessarily fighting the Civil War because of slavery. In fact, a lot of them were very upset when Abraham Lincoln came up with the Emancipation Proclamation, because they felt that they were fighting the war because the South wanted to secede from the Union. A lot of people did not feel like they were fighting the war for slavery. So when Thaddeus Stevens comes out and says, just take all the white people's land, divvy it up, and give it to freed slaves, many people did not like this, even in the North. But at the same time, in the federal government, the Civil Rights Bill was put into effect in 1866, and this basically argued that all persons born in the U.S. were citizens and they had rights without regard for race. Okay, so this is kind of what we think of as a citizen today, right? If you are born in America, no matter if your parents are not U.S. citizens, you are a U.S. citizen. So that's where this comes from. Johnson vetoes it, actually, but it goes through anyways. At the same time, or in succession, the 14th and 15th Amendment were created. The 14th Amendment said that all citizens and the federal government has the job to protect their rights. All citizens have equal protection from the law. It did not say that freed slaves could vote, but it does say if you deny the people the right to vote, then the Congress could step in and your power in Congress would diminish. So basically what the 14th Amendment says is, we know that freed slaves cannot vote in the South, but if you do not let them vote, you will not have any power in Congress. So basically the federal government is saying, you better allow people to vote, or being a U.S. Senator from the South is going to mean little to nothing. You will have no power to do anything. Along with this, a little later, comes the Reconstruction Act, which was in March 1861 and 1867. This also goes over Johnson's veto, and basically what it did was it divided the South into 5 military districts, created a new state government, and it allowed black men to vote. And this is when radical Reconstruction really begins. Um, in fact, they actually try to impeach President Johnson, and they almost did. They fell short by one vote. Okay, so this is where the Congress and President Johnson really start banging their heads against each other. Okay, I, I think it's hard for us to imagine today, but or maybe not. Having the vote meant being an American. Today we take this for granted, but this is something that everybody wanted. Everybody wants to be able to have a say in their government. And so that is why this whole idea of giving freed slaves the vote is so radical, because it used to be white males only. Okay, and a lot of people are scared. They argue, well, that's 4 million more votes. People in the South know that the African American vote was going to be a huge deal, but they tried to keep it off as long as possible. But the North is kind of starting to push themselves in. A year after this, and the 15th Amendment was passed, and also in 1868, Ulysses S. Grant becomes president. What the 15th Amendment does is it prohibits the federal or state government's right to interfere or deny anyone's vote. So the 15th Amendment says the state or the feds cannot deny anyone the right to vote. Okay, and this is kind of what people start calling the Great Constitutional Revolution, because the two huge products of the war were a newly empowered national state. Right now, the United States is a republic of United States. Right, it's a nation now, kind of for the first time. And then this whole idea of a national citizenry enjoying the law, not just white men, women, Asian Americans, African Americans, Mexican Americans, Puerto Rican Americans, any person who lives in the United States for the first time in history kind of has this idea that since I am part of the citizenry, I shall be able to vote for people and make my own laws and be a part of this nation. Okay, this is a fairly new concept in the United States, fairly new, because the United States history isn't that long. All right, and what it really did was it changed the Constitution from federal-state relations and rights of property into this vehicle to deal with minorities and their rights. Okay, so one person calls it the tocsin, which means warning bell of freedom. Okay, so what we believe of the Constitution today is really starting to be put in effect after the Civil War. Okay, the one problem though, and we'll talk about this, is women are shunned from this. Because of the Civil War, and even though women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others are getting good press and really are trying to get women rights, the United States is very slow in making women equal to men. This won't happen basically for another 40, 50 years. But what also ends up happening is by 1870, all the Confederate states were back in the Union, and they started to be run by Republicans with state constitutions, and African Americans are starting to be voted into office. The one state where African Americans from the outset had a very good say in how the government was run was in South Carolina, because in South Carolina, once they got the vote, they were 60% of the voting population. In most other southern states, even though they got the vote, freed slaves were still outnumbered by the white community. So really in South Carolina, this is where the African American vote really takes hold, and it does stuff. By 1870, some 2,000 freed slaves were office holders of some sort, whether that's Congress, state legislator, uh, city council, which doesn't sound like a lot, but you got to remember, 5 years ago, they were African Americans in the South were not even considered basically as human beings, right? So, even though we'll end with radical Reconstruction not working, the seeds of it are still planted. There were 14 African Americans in the House. A man by the name of Hiram Revels was the first senator in U.S. history in 1870. Um, so things are starting to turn around. At the same time, like we talked about on the slide before, these carpetbaggers, these what they call scallywags, other things of that nature, funny names that people in the old days used to have for other people, um, are really, even though the South and the North are coming together with the Constitution, and every state in the South has said, yes, we'll be part of the Union, there's still just this simmering resentment for the North and the South. Okay? Um, but at the same time, Reconstruction did have accomplishments. Like we talked about, they did build state-supported schools. Most were segregated, but still, this is a huge deal for poor whites and for freed slaves. Um, it made it illegal for companies to not hire based on race. Of course, obviously, it did happen still. You could not hire somebody. You just couldn't say it was based on race. You would say they're not qualified or whatever. But it did make it illegal. In South Carolina, there was a land commission that by 1876 had settled 14,000 African American families on their own land. And so this kind of ties in with what a lot of freed slaves believed was freedom, right? They're getting land, the federal government is helping them, and in turn, they're creating an economy and they're prospering and they're giving and they're part of society, okay? Um, and really, what a lot of people in the radical Republicans and Reconstruction movements in the North, they really did want to create prosperity for everyone. They really wanted to kind of create this semblance of a union because the chasm was so deep after the war. And in some places, like South Carolina, this helped. Unfortunately, in other places, the resentment was too deep and Reconstruction kind of comes to an end by the mid 1870s because the South really rebelled against it, and that's what we'll talk about in the fourth and the last PowerPoint slide. The the last slide will kind of talk about how the South reacted to Reconstruction. Not everybody in the South, but a lot of people, and kind of how they basically overthrow Reconstruction. Most of the traditional leaders of the Southern way of life, the old senators, the old congressmen, the old city council members, uh, anybody who had any type of leadership responsibility before and during the Civil War, despised what was happening, despised the fact that the North came in and said, we're putting in our own people, and they despised the fact that African Americans were starting to get put into Congress and in the House. The taxes were rising because the North had to pay for Reconstruction somehow. So what was happening is the North was taxing the South and raising those taxes, and it was paying for Reconstruction, which most of them hated anyways, right? So that's kind of a vicious cycle there. And things just weren't really going in the right direction. But the bottom line is what people were most upset about was the ideas of slaves owning land, what they considered to be slaves, owning land and being able to hold office and vote was insufferable. This is just something that most people in the South could not come to terms with. And so what ends up happening is the quote unquote reign of terror, which comes from the French Revolution, where that's when people started getting their heads cut off in the guillotine. Um, and at the beginning, and this is, I'm not going to go into the KKK that much. So if you want to do, I know a lot of people are interested in them just because it's kind of the first real. They're basically the first real terrorists in American history. If you don't count what a lot of what happened during the Revolutionary War, but it's the real first organized terrorist cell in America. So there's a lot of um, people are very interested in it. So, but I'm not going to go in it too much. But if you'd like, um, I think I'm going to put up a link to this to a video that another professor gave me that's very interesting on the KKK. And if you'd like to do your PowerPoint presentation on it, then that's more than fine. But what ends up happening is this reign of terror. It starts kind of local and unorganized, and what ends up happening is African Americans or Asian Americans, anybody who's not white, or people who they think are Reconstructionists, people from the North, they begin to be assaulted or even lynched for refusing to give way on sidewalks or using quote-unquote insolent language. When they were challenging contracts, people were starting to learn how to read, right? And so now they're reading contracts before they're signing them, and this is something that people in the South weren't used to. And even attempting to buy land was cause for, in a lot of places, for getting assaulted or being lynched. Um, but really, when the North comes in 1867 and Reconstruction really begins, this is when secret societies start to form. And the KKK had formed in 1866. Most people agree with that date, but it really comes to fruition a year later once the North moves in. Um, and really, they commit some of the most brutal crimes in the history of our country, no question about it. But like I said earlier, people in the South, this is not just against freed slaves. This is anybody of color. The KKK hated Catholics, like we've already mentioned. This is anybody who has come down and threatened their way of life, and that's what it is. It's their livelihood, their way of life that they've known for 250 years. It's being threatened, and so they react violently to this. Okay. And what happens is in Colfax, Louisiana, in 1873, may or may not be the KKK. Nobody really knows, but it's armed whites who assaulted the town. Colfax, Louisiana, was a town where a lot of African Americans lived, and it had become a town. They had government. This is where African Americans owned land. They owned houses. They owned businesses. This is a place, you can't maybe not say the word flourishing, but it's a place where they felt safe and they were free. And it was a good example of a town or a community where freed people had congregated and had created a life for themselves. But what ends up happening is these people come into Colfax, and not really sure the numbers, but hundreds of freedmen were murdered, including 50 or so who it is known that surrendered. They had their hands up. Okay, so like I said, there are some similarities into today's world about what happened in the South after the war, and so what ends up happening is Congress starts enacting these enforcement acts, which is basically banning terrorism. And 2 years before Colfax, Ulysses S. Grant had actually sent down troops to arrest and find the KKK. So by 1872, the KKK was dysfunctional. That is why when Colfax happened in 1860 or 1873, many people don't think it was the KKK because U.S. Grant had done a very good job of eliminating the KKK, but it was probably some of the same people, They just didn't necessarily call themselves the Klan. Um, and the other problem is by the time of Colfax, 1873, 1874, 1875, liberal Republicans, people from the North who had really come down, these are people from the Freedmen Bureau, people who were voted in, people who were sent from the North to govern the South, were basically, they were tired of being there. And they said, listen, it's been 8 years. In most places, we're still dealing with this resentment. We're not getting a whole lot of things done. And they said, and by 1874, 1875, a lot of these liberal Republicans saying, I want to go back home, and what I really want to do, what I think we should do, is let freed slaves figure it out themselves. And they said the federal government down here needs to be curtailed because nobody's listening to what we're saying. Okay. Even they really even thought that the best men of the South were being excluded because they were Confederates. Um, and the liberal Republicans' argument was the powerful white people from the South know the South better than we do. We've taken away a lot of their power and we've taken away a lot of their land, but we don't know what we're doing down here. They do. What we need to do is give them back the power so they can run the government because what we're doing is not working. Okay, so this is a direct reverse of what was happening in 1866, 67, 68, where these people were zealously going down there saying, we're going to fix the South. Slaves are going to be free. Everybody's going to get the vote. Everybody's going to go to school. Everybody's going to be equal. And we'll all be happy. But by 1874, 1875, people are saying, wait a minute. People are getting lynched every day. We can't contain these terrorist attacks. There aren't many places like Colfax, Louisiana, where people, freed slaves, are living in prosperity, or so to speak, something like that, creating a life for themselves. And they said, we're tired of it. Why don't we just leave and let them do what they need to be done? So by then, not only were things getting corrupt, but also in 1873 to 1875, and there was an economic downturn, and the South was hit really hard. And so what ends up happening is, since the South was part of the Union again, because cotton prices had gotten so low, and because that's what the South's main economy was, besides tobacco, the North was sending tons and tons and tons of money down to the South to help try and rebuild it. And so people in the North even started saying to themselves, well, wait a minute, now we're getting taxed high and all of our money is being sent down to the South. 10 years ago we were fighting them. The whole reason why we had the Civil War was because of them. And a lot of people in the North, unfortunately, were also saying, I don't care if African Americans get the vote. There was a lot of arguments by a lot of Northern Democrats and even some liberal Republicans saying, listen, we gave them 10 years. They need to figure things out on their own. Okay, so what ends up happening is, by mid-1870s, the North begins to retreat from the South. And in 1874, the southern states took control of the House of Representatives. And it was a triumph of these people called Redeemers, who we'll discuss in the next PowerPoint. These Redeemers who wanted to redeem the South from the North and create a society based on what the South used to be, not what the North was telling it to do. They said, we're going to rid the South of Northern corruption, misgovernment, and especially free Northern or black control. Okay, so what ends up happening in 1874 and 1875 is lynchings start to rise again and violence begins to ensue. And as Northerners are leaving, Ulysses S. Grant less and less has the power to stop what's happening in the North. So by 1875, the North has very little presence in the South. African Americans are beaten or assaulted or told not to vote because if you do vote, bad things are going to happen to you and your family. And so in 1874, white people win in landslide elections in the South and they take control of the House. And we'll discuss kind of what happens after that. But the whole point of this PowerPoint is to show that not only what people viewed freedom as, but that the next 10 years of life in the South, even though there were a lot of good ideas and a lot of good intentions, what ends up happening is the South kind of retreats back to what it was before the war, minus African Americans actually being slaves.